Racetracks evolve. They change, they get modified. It's just part and parcel of the way that racing and the technology has become what it was since the first cars were raced back in the early part of the 20th century. Because let's face it, as much as some would love to see it, there is absolutely no way that modern Formula 1 cars are going to race on the sort of courses that were seen in the so-called good old days. Tracks like Reims, for instance, or Pescara in Italy, which is the longest circuit to ever host a Grand Prix. 16 miles long it was, making it longer than the Nürburgring, which, as we all know, is the only racetrack on the planet. But those tracks, Pescara, Reims, and even the old Spa layout along with the Nürburgring, are all gone. Tracks have been shortened, race distances standardised, and safety has come a long way since the days of Clark, Hill, Bandini, Stewart, Brabham and Surtees. But there was still one track left. Hockenheim. The old Hockenheim, and I'm not going to say the original Hockenheim because the original was a different shape running a different direction, was a 4.2 mile or 6.8 kilometre track that in a way was the closest thing Formula 1 had to an oval at that point. Flat out blast through the forest where even in the 80s cars would have been doing over 200 miles an hour, and these flat out blasts being punctuated by 3 chicanes. One around the site of Jim Clark's fatal crash in 1968 and called the Clark chicane as a result, a second at the Ostkurve where Patrick Depailler was killed in 1980, and a third added down the backstretch coming back through towards the stadium section. The cars then went through the stadium section with very little downforce on the cars, meaning that the cars were on the edge all the time in terms of the grip going through there. The track was super fast, but it had its problems. Number one is all the overtaking happened into the 3 chicanes, so those sat in the stadium section just saw a snake of cars coming through every lap with no action. The second is that the track was pretty narrow, so getting 3 wide was incredibly risky compared to other circuits. And third is that it was a race of attrition. Engines exploded, cars ran out of fuel, tyres would blow, and so on. Back in the non-refueling days, the teams had to gamble on turning the engines down to make it to the end or turn it up for performance and risk it blowing up. A few of the drivers at the time hated it. Yet F1 still turned up. The noise of the cars flying through the forest really tickles the nostalgia senses, seeing cars appear at the race with front and rear wings that were really for show than anything else, as they sought to get every last bit of top speed they could, and watching and waiting for the lottery of which cars would and wouldn't make the end, such as Gerhard Berger losing the win with a couple of laps left to run in 1996, or Mika Hakkinen crashing out bigly in 1999. But there were 2 other issues that would rear their heads for the 2000 race in 2000. This was round 3 of the Schumacher vs Hakkinen battles, with Schumacher now being supported by Rubens Barrichello and Hakkinen still partnered with the ever-dependable team player that was David Coulthard. Schumacher was leading the championship by 8 points going into this race, and with reliability a key factor at Hockenheim and the championship points being a lot closer than now between first and third, if Schumacher's Ferrari didn't finish and Hakkinen in the McLaren did, that 8 points could be overhauled so easily. And the qualifying session was held in changing damp conditions, with Coulthard winning that lottery with the weather and putting his McLaren on pole ahead of Schumacher by over a second. Such was the messed up nature of that session, Fisichella was 3rd and Pedro de la Rosa, in uncompetitive arrows, was 5th. Further back, Jenson Button's Williams was 16th, which sounds normal today, but in those days the car would have been a lot further up the grid, and Barrichello in the Ferrari was way back in 18th. At the start of the race, Schumacher and Coulthard bogged down, and DC moved to block Schumacher to allow Hakkinen to swoop round both of them and into the lead. Seeing Hakkinen start to go round, the Michael moved left in an attempt to block the McLaren but caught Fisichella's front wing, sending the Benetton and the Ferrari out into the gravel on the outside of turn 1. No red flag, no safety car. Everything carried on, although after the race Michael accused Fisichella of wiping him out deliberately. When Fisichella was told about this, he simply said, "Well, he was the one who cut across me and hit the brakes. What was I supposed to do?" Such was the pace between the best and worst cars in those days. Barrichello went from 18th to 10th on the first lap, while both arrows of the world's greatest test driver and Verstappen were in the top 6 and on for points if the race finished as it was. By lap 11, Barrichello was into 4th and he became the first to pit on lap 17th, which put him back in 6th. The McLarens by lap 20 were 22 seconds ahead of Trulli's Jordan in 3rd, and it looked nice and comfortable for them. Until lap 25, that is, when Martin Brundle interrupted Murray Walker to say that there was a strange guy on the side of the track in a raincoat. The safety car was scrambled and the excited Murray Walker exclaimed, "That lunatic, whoever he is, has just changed the complexion of this race." Can you say that today? Probably not. Either way, Hakkinen and Coulthard were coming through the stadium section and the worry was they'd have to double stack. But it was made even more mad when Hakkinen pulled in and Coulthard did another lap, meaning that DC would catch the safety car, be held up, have everybody catch up to him, and then he'd lose more time as a result. Coulthard caught the safety car just before the first chicane with Hakkinen in third. It actually looked like they were the only two cars in the race thanks to the way the track was, but the focus was on whoever this bloke was and how he'd managed to get on the track. The fan, the man, the lunatic, the whatever he was referred as that day was Robert Saley, a Mercedes-Benz employee who had been let go by the company because of health reasons. Saley was protesting his dismissal while at the same time risking his life, as he was crossing the track as a train of cars headed by Della Rosa headed towards him and getting on for 200 miles an hour. Saley had exploited a huge hole in the security fence to get onto the other side of the barriers and make his little protest, and had actually attempted to get onto the grid prior to the start of the race, but was turned away. The race resumed again on lap 29 with the McLarens losing out big time in the safety car phase. A little later there was an incident between Alesi and Deniz just before the third chicane that totally wrecked the Frenchman's car, and because the car had spun like a bottle so quickly, Alesi was left with dizziness that lasted for 3 whole days following. The safety car was out again but went back in on lap 31. Safety cars tended to not be that long in terms of laps here because the track was so long. On the next lap it started to rain, and again because of the length of the track the rain was only falling in one specific part of the track, that being the stadium section. The rain intensified and absolutely soaked that one part of the track while the rest of it was dry, which meant that teams and drivers had to make a decision. Put on wets that would have been fine in the section where grip was needed and then have them destroyed on the straights as they overheated, or keep on dries and tiptoe through that particular section. Hakkinen and most of the field had pitted for wets, and while Hakkinen was 3 seconds faster than Barrichello through the stadium, Rubinho made it all back up elsewhere as dry tyres on a dry track work better than wet tyres on a dry track. Who'd have thought? And while the rain did come more in the last lap or so, Barrichello held on and took the first ever victory of his career, and it was a victory that was very popular with fans, media and teams alike. McLaren would have been disappointed to miss out on the win, but even then they were not going to begrudge the fact that after 7 years in the sport, Rubens had taken his first win through a good gamble with the weather and also driving like a madman in the opening few laps. The win was made sweeter for a couple more reasons too. Number 1 is that horrendous crash in 1994 at Imola that was the first of the 3 big ones that weekend. The other 2 claiming the lives of drivers involved, with one of those drivers being Barrichello's friend, mentor and idol, Ayrton Senna. The win was also the first for a Brazilian driver since 1993, and on the podium Barrichello was sobbing because he had flashbacks to his father selling the family car to give him one last shot at getting up the racing ladder. With that win in Formula 1 now achieved, it made all the sacrifices and the grind absolutely worth it. Meanwhile, the talk was about the track invader. He was fined by the police and by the circuit for trespassing, and Mercedes later investigated the issue and gave him a compensation package for unfair dismissal. So the protest, I guess, was worth it in the end. At the same time, everybody in the paddock thought that the invasion was a serious concern and should not be allowed to happen again. Yeah, about that. As for Hockenheim, the nails were being pounded firmly into the coffin. The FIA was now looking at it and decided that the time had come to make serious changes to the circuit. Given the speeds involved, if there was a serious downpour while the cars were still doing 200 miles an hour down those back straights, there was going to be a huge accident. Even more so if a car vaulted up over the back of another, Mark Webber at Valencia style. And if a car did bounce over the fence and into the trees, you can bet people would be screaming, how was this allowed to happen? 2001 would be the final race at the classic layout, and Juan Pablo Montoya set a lap record for that race. And today, Hockenheim is a shadow of its former self. Hermann Tilke wanted to extend the track to where the first chicane was so a proper tribute to Clark could be installed, but the circuit owners had already sold the land back to the German government or the local state government, so it wasn't possible. So we have the layout used post-2002, which isn't as bad as people make it out to be, really. But I guess it's like that old Dara O'Brien joke, nostalgia is heroin for old people. But I guess that's something that someone is likely to mention in the comments. So then, a look at the race that basically condemned the historic Hockenheim to the history books. If you remember this race and this video has brought back the memories, then do like the video, and for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on a future video. So until next time, I've been a allergy-infested AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.